My name is Josiah, and today I'll be discussing how screen time is suspected to affect the development of behavioral disorders in adolescents and teens. So, this is a topic that caught my attention after reading chapter 16 of our textbook, and we learned a little bit about conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder in this chapter, and kind of a throwback to chapter 13. But let's jump into some of the theoretical framework. So, these disorders are kind of marked and described by specific behaviors: aggression, bullying, rule breaking. I wanted to explore how modern day stressors like screen time could be influencing these particular coincidences of diagnosis for these disorders. And the study that I'm presenting kind of derives from, what we've talked about, the diathesis stress model, which we covered in this chapter a little bit and in previous ones. That notion that some children kind of have a genetic predisposition to certain behaviors. These environmental factors like screen time, for example, right, underscored in this study, they trigger these specific behaviors and lead to the consequential diagnoses of these disorders. So in this study, they really wanted to particularly focus on social media, but we'll kind of jump into that. There you have the explanation of what conduct disorder is, its connection to the textbook, and then another note is just about comorbidities, earlier diagnoses of conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder, as indicated by the book, go on to predict later instances of substance abuse and anxiety. All right, so that's a little bit about the framework. Now let's jump right into the study and the focus. So the researchers posed two main hypotheses. Firstly, that higher screen time would lead to an increase in these behavioral problems and the diagnosis of these disruptive behavioral disorders. And secondly, that different types of screen interaction, social media, gaming, TV, they also looked at texting. They have varying impacts. They suspected that each of these different kinds of media would affect and exacerbate the diagnosis of these disorders accordingly. So they ended up doing so by following in a cohort study about 12,000 children. It was closer to like 11,700, but we rounded up, of course. 9 to 11 years old. They collected data on how much time they spent on screens. It was a self-reported study, so the students kind of worked with families to come up with a decent figure of how much screen time they have using each of the different modalities. And then the second part of the study was a year later. They went on to hear back from the parents. Were they diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder? And of course, it was correlational. It wasn't like, okay, because they, looked at a screen for a few hours a day, it directly caused them to, develop the disorders. But there is some correlation, and the findings were as follows. The study found that for every additional hour that scholars spent on social media, the risk of developing conduct disorder jumped 62%, right? 4+ hours, along that continuum of interaction with each of the different modalities, 4+ hours raised the likelihood of conduct disorder diagnosis by about 69% and oppositional defiant disorder by 46%. But social media was the biggest, the most significant and impactful factor related to diagnosis of conduct disorder. So gaming and texting were more closely associated with oppositional defiant disorder, but all in all, these findings suggested that the way adolescents interact with screens and the duration of those interactions, they really play significant roles in behavioral development. So they ended up, supporting their hypotheses with this study, and really interesting stuff. So moving on to the real world connection. As educators, we really have to be mindful of how screen time is being utilized not only at home, not so much that we can affect that directly, but especially in the classroom where we have a bit more purview and a bit more agency. As we continue to transform the educational landscape and look at how we are further integrating technology into the classroom, it also brings about questions about, medical assessment, right? How much farther should medical professionals be considering screen time in diagnosis of developmental disorders? It has a lot of real world application. Okay, so the discussion question that I kind of want to pitch to the class Given what we know about this connection between screen time and behavior problems, how do we as educators and caregivers help scholars and adolescents develop healthier habits surrounding their use of technology?